Hi, welcome back to the Free Swatches channel. In today's video, which is the 9th in the series of £100 to Rolex, I'm going to be taking apart the Omega 30mm movement that I showed you in the last video. This movement is in need of restoration, but what I wanted to do in this video was to compare the movement with some modern components that you get in a modern mechanical watch, in the hope that I can explain to you why I think, in my opinion, the Omega 30mm family of movements were the best movements that Omega ever produced. They really are fantastic, and hopefully you'll be able to see in a minute when we go over to the bench just the quality of the parts that we used. Just a couple of other things to mention. As far as the restoration of the watch is going in general, I've still got quite a lot of work to do. I've got to restore the case, which needs some gentle refinishing in order to bring out the best of it. It's currently looking rather tired, and I've also in the process of getting the dial restored as well. So whilst those two things are going on in the background, this is a great opportunity for me to show you the movement itself, which was the reason why I bought this watch in the first place. It's, as I say, it's my favourite Omega movement, so I'm really keen to go through and explain to you why that is. So we'll go over to the bench now, we'll have a look, and I can show you the movement in more detail. We're going to try and get some really good macro shots, and hopefully I can explain to you, why I think it's so good. Okay, here we are at the bench. We've set up the camera for an overhead view, in the hope that this is going to be a much better way of seeing what's going on when we do macro shots with movements. I hope this is going to be a better view and a better way of actually seeing what's going on. So here we are. So we've got the movement in front of us. So this is Omega caliber 265. Just from I'm pointing here, you've got the Omega logo and it says 265. So that's the caliber number there. Across here we have the serial number, which is unique to each individual movement that was made by the Omega production. This starts to 13 million, so we'll be able to date the movement from that. What I'm going to do when the watch is all together is to do a whole video explaining the history of the watch, and I'll obviously cover that date in a bit more detail then. So to go through some movement parts then, just as a start, we've got the barrel bridge here. See this part here? When pocket watches were produced, obviously, going back quite a long time ago, it was often called a three-quarter plate because it would also take in the train bridge as well. But this movement has got a separate train bridge and barrel bridge. So the barrel bridge is here. So the barrel bridge is covering up the barrel, obviously, but it's also covering up the winding parts which are here, which is the keyless mechanism, which is on the other side of the movement. You've got the centre wheel here as well, so the barrel drives the centre wheel. This is the train bridge over here. So the train bridge is stamped with the Omega logo. You've got two screws securing the train bridge. There's 15 jewels here, Swiss, and then you have the 3 jewels for the third wheel, the fourth wheel, and the escape wheel. This is known as the train. It's 3 wheels that are being driven by this centre wheel here. The power gets driven down to the escapement, which then regulates the power, and that regulation of the power allows the power to escape from the spring under here in a very sort of set way, and allows the timekeeping to be taken from there. The first thing to talk about with the Omega 30mm is the overall aesthetics of the movements. Now, I'm not certain if, obviously I don't know the thought process behind this when it was designed back in the 30s, but they did a really good job of designing what is a very aesthetically pleasing movement. You've got a very nice shape to all the components. So if you notice the barrel bridge here, it comes down and around this centre wheel in a very sort of organic shape. The same with the train bridge here as well. It just comes in and it's just nicely rounded off. There are no sharp edges. Everything seems to fit together really nicely. And also this design as such, the way that the barrel bridge is cut in, allows access to almost the view of the entire balance wheel. The balance wheel is obviously the main event when it comes to a watch movement, because it's the part that is moving the most frequently. It's the part that can be seen, and obviously when you look at this you can see most of the balance wheel. It's not concealed in the way that it often is with modern movements. So you almost feel as if this movement was in some way designed with aesthetics in mind. I don't know if this is true or not, but I certainly find it a very appealing movement to work on. The movement is copper plated, so we've got this nice gold colour, and it's quite austere in its finishing. One of the things that separates high-end watches is the finishing of the plates, and you'll see on this movement that there isn't much finishing. The finishing is quite functional really. You have a grain pattern here, but you'll notice also the way that the grain pattern is matched on the barrel bridge as it is on the train bridge, so that does unify, and also on the balance cock here as well. So it does provide it with a nice uniform appearance all the way across the movement. You'll see that we have a frosted main plate. You can just see here just where the balance wheel is. When I say frosted, I mean it hasn't got a sort of lined or grained pattern. Frosting is a bit like sandblasting in modern terms. You know, it just gives you a very kind of matte finish, which does provide a nice contrast with the bridges on the top. The finishing of the steel parts is once again quite straightforward, but you do have a nice circular finish on here. So when I wind this up, you'll see. Just see if you can see that. You can see a kind of circular pattern on the ratchet wheel as it goes round. So the crown wheel and core are finished in the similar pattern to the ratchet wheel. So it all makes for a very nice, appealing combination. The other nice thing about this that I think is appealing are the flat screws. The screws have a very flat head on them, and so when that's polished, it does really look nice. And I think I prefer this in comparison to more rounded screws. The only rounded screw you have here is for this setting lever here. This is a rounded screw, but it is also set slightly further in. So I think it would look a bit odd if it was flat, because then it would be flat, but then the surface of the barrel bridge would be a bit higher up. So aesthetically, as I've mentioned, very pleasing. You've got a very straightforward regulator here, which is a polished finish, and this has got the Inca block setting being the 265 calibre. So yeah, that's the aesthetics. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to take the movement apart. So I'm going to cut while I do that, because the way I'm set up, I'm not really geared up to actually work on the watch. I think all you'd see is the back of my head if I were to do that. So we're going to cut the shot here. I'm just going to take these parts off, and then what I want to do is a comparison between these components and some modern equivalents, just to show the quality of the parts that we used in the manufacture of this movement. Okay, so I've just taken the plates off of the top of the movement now, and so we've got the barrel bridge here, we've got the train bridge here, and you can see here's the movement with the parts uncovered. So what I wanted to do is to use this as an opportunity to show you some of these parts in comparison to their modern counterparts. The movement I'm going to use for this is a Soprod A10, which is a fairly high grade mechanical movement that's been fitted into numerous different watches, mainly because it takes a module quite well. So let's start, just going to reach over, let's start here. So this is a barrel bridge from a Soprod A10. So if I were to put that next to the one up here, firstly you'll notice is obviously a size difference, but the main thing that you notice with these that really, to me, makes them great is you can see it finishing underneath. If I were to just turn this vertically so that you can see the thickness of the component, and then to take the Soprod part and do the same thing. So you see when I turn this one up vertically, it almost disappears, it's so thin. These are really sort of quite flimsy components, but you can see here with the 30mm barrel bridge, just the thickness and the amount of material that we've used. These movements were made at a time before watch manufacturers and designers in watch manufacturers had to worry about aesthetics, and in the 1970s watches started to really slim down and get quite slim, and so the movement, the priority of the movement design was to become thinner, and obviously this wasn't a consideration back then, so these movements, they didn't have to worry about the sort of amount of material and the thickness of the movement. I think this also applies to the diameter. The 30mm diameter of this movement is unusually wide for a watch movement. If I were to get the main plate here, this is the main plate from the Soprod, and to offer it up against, you'll see that this is about 27mm, and it's one of the larger diameter movements that is currently in production. You'll see the difference there, so it's nice to have that substantial feel to the movements as well. You'll also see these screws. If I were to put these screws onto their side, if you can see, but the heads of the screws are really quite thick, generously proportioned screws. What you often find with modern screws is they are quite flimsy and easily damaged, but these are such a thick screw, and they just have a real feel of quality to them, and everything goes together well. It's quite hard to demonstrate this, but if I were to get this barrel bridge and to fit it back on, it just clips back into place. It's the equivalent of, years ago they would say that you listen to the sound of a Rolls-Royce car door when it closes. It's a similar thing to that. It just, everything clicks together really nicely in a way that you don't tend to find in modern movements. I mean, this barrel bridge, for example, from the sock rod, I mean, you can just physically, if I were to grab that with my fingers, you could bend that in half, you know, whereas with this part, I don't think I'm strong enough to be able to actually affect that sort of change in this component. So that's sort of a good way of describing it. The train bridge is really nice just because of its simplicity. It's very clear, you can see exactly what's going on in the movement. You have the 3 jewels there, which are for the train. And let's take some of the wheels out now so I can show you some of those, because the wheels are also similarly proportioned. Let's just grab those. One wheel that I have got to show you, this is effectively the smallest wheel in the train here. This is the escape wheel, which is made of hardened steel as the teeth engage with the jewels on the pallets. And if I were to compare this with the escape wheel from the sock rod, let's just move that in. It's probably quite hard to see this, but you can probably see the difference in the size of the teeth, the size of the component overall, but also one thing that probably won't pick up that well on the camera is the actual thickness of the wheel itself. This is a much better quality part in terms of thickness and size in comparison to this. Something I've noticed with high-end Swiss watches with their own manufacture movements, especially in my time when I was a watchmaker for Girard-Perregaux, I noticed that the Swiss tend to equate quality with fineness, but for me, personally, I think that quality in a watch movement is in solidity and in the physical structure of the components being well made. And to make a component fine means it's going to wear out quite quickly, and it's going to be much more prone to issues. Whereas these movements, I say, are a favourite amongst watchmakers. And I think that's mainly because the components are so well made that you don't have the problems that you would often associate with these sort of finer movements, as it were. Let's move on to the barrel now and have a look at this. So this is the barrel. The barrel here holds the spring inside of it that drives the watch. And what you can see here is a really, fairly significant, substantial, solid part. And let's just bring the barrel over from the A10. So that's the A10 barrel. The teeth are smaller and finer, and their diameter is much smaller. The way that for example, with this one, if I were to take the lid off, the lid is much thicker and less prone to being bent. Whereas if this was to be pushed off, it's much easier to bend this lid. It's a much flimsier component. So the spring's obviously bigger as well to go along with the size of the movement. So there's some interesting observations there. Another thing I was going to mention is the balance wheel. Now the balance on this is particularly attractive. So what I'm going to do is just take the balance. I'm just going to cut the video for a second. We're going to take the balance cock off, and I'll show you the balance itself. Okay, here's the balance wheel. So this balance wheel, obviously in a movement that was designed in the 30s, has some traditional features to it. It has weights around the edge of the balance. See, these weights, it's a bit like a car wheel. The weight of the balance wheel has to be completely even, so there's no sort of heavy spots on the movement, on the balance. This is something that they got round in later years by combining different metals to make a bimetallic balance that would obviously compensate for heat that way. So in some respects, this old-fashioned style is a bit of a nuisance, but one thing to note with this movement is that you don't tend to have problems with these. They're generally quite good. But the main thing I wanted to show you on this balance wheel that is really nice is this Breguet overcoil hairspring. So this was a design by Breguet many years ago that allows the regulating coil of the spring to sit above the other turns of the spring. So the spring has to run obviously concentrically from the centre, so if you imagine the coils coming out like this. And the issue with a flat spring without the overcoil is that the end of the spring, the terminal curve of the spring, where the watch is regulated, where the movement is regulated, is also forming part of the concentric shape of the spring. So but it can't be concentric because obviously it has to come out and to create a separate section for the regulator to move along. So Breguet got around this by making a separate coil that sits above. So when the balance wheel swings backwards and forwards, the hairspring is able to breathe concentrically, which is a much better way of regulating it. I think in reality nowadays it doesn't really make much difference in terms of regulation, but it is certainly a much nicer component. It's very well made. I don't know if you can also see that this is a blue steel hairspring, which aesthetically is really nice as well. I'm just going to bring in the stop rod balance now so we can make a comparison between the two, and really there is no comparison because you can see the difference in size. You can see that this balance wheel is so much smaller, and obviously this wheel oscillates backwards and forwards to an angle of about 280 degrees. It's doing that quite regularly, and the smaller the component, obviously the more wear you're going to get on parts like the pivot, for example. I mean, this is a balance wheel that has been in this watch for sort of, over 60 years now. I haven't been able to detect much in the way of wear on it, and I think it's largely down just to the sheer quality of the way it's constructed. You also see this has got a modern flat hairspring. One thing to mention about this comparison is that this is a balance that is from an escapement that runs at 18,000 beats per hour, which is relatively slow in today's standards, whereas these modern ones run at 21,600. In order to achieve the higher speed, which is supposedly for better regulation and accuracy, the spring has to be shorter. So there is a reason why the spring on this one is shorter, on the stop rod is shorter than it is on the 30mm. This is a much more lethargic spring. But I think that when you're looking at mechanical watches and accuracy, and also, if you're interested in those things, the aesthetics and the beauty of the movement itself are important. And I personally would quite like the thought of having this larger balance wheel swinging, at 18,000 beats per hour over this thing that's sort of manically doing sort of 21,600. They're quite a different thing to watch. This is a much more enjoyable movement to watch work in comparison to this, which seems to be just sort of really going at quite a rate. It's something that you'll notice in the tick as well. You'll notice that these larger components in 30mm movements do result in a much larger tick, which is quite a reassuring thing if you like mechanical watches. And you can hear the watch ticking along nicely. It is an enjoyable thing, and the 30mm has got a very nice sort of solid tick to it as well when it's running. So there we go. There's a few details on the balance itself. Hopefully that's enough detail to perhaps convince you that this movement is in many ways far superior to what is being made today. I mean, I'm being a bit facetious because obviously modern manufacturing is such that parts have to be made to a certain specification to achieve a certain result. I think there is a reason why only real sort of handmade movements, like things that Roger Smith makes, for example, have this sort of solidity to it. I've spoken to Roger about this movement before, and he's definitely a big fan of it as well, and certainly agrees. And although I think in his movements you see a lot of the three-dimensional qualities you get in pocket watch movements, you can't deny that there is a certain sort of similarity in terms of quality with these. Not to say this is obviously the same as what Roger Smith does, but it's certainly there is a similarity there in terms of the kind of the philosophy behind making something that is in some respects simple, but also very, very good quality because of the solidity and the rigidity of it. And this movement, I'd be quite convinced, will still be around, in 200 years' time, as long as certain parts can be found for it. It's quite a basic thing. One thing I will do quickly, just to conclude this section of the video, is just to turn the movement over so that we can have a look at the keyless. So the keyless components are the parts that you engage with when you pull the crown in and out. Just move these parts out of the way. I'm just going to quickly show you what happens when I pull this in and out. You can probably hear there's a definite click. I'll get my microphone close. I don't know if you heard that, but it's testament to the quality of these components again. This part here is a really solid, it's a spring that's attached, and it uses that method that I mentioned, like with tree branches, where it such a nicely shaped component, and it clicks nicely backwards and forwards on there when you engage the keyless. If I were to compare this with the keyless on the stop rod, you'll see a very big difference here. So it's quite hard to see because there's so many components. Because this is obviously done quite simply, but some of these modern movements have a lot more components to do the same thing. This is the stop rod keyless work here, and you'll notice the parts are smaller, more likely to get problems with this, just because it's slightly overcomplicated, something that is quite simple. All that happens is the stem gets pulled out in and out, so it needs something to click against. So you have a setting lever and a setting lever spring, and they just click backwards and forwards. So the simplicity of this design is really a great thing, because it does give the design longevity and it makes it enjoyable to use as well. So once again, a really great design there from Omega, and to think that was made in the 1930s and mass produced is really quite impressive. Well, thanks very much for sticking with the video. I hope that was interesting to have a look at the Omega 30mm in more detail. As you can see, just the sheer size and the thickness of the components are really testament to the quality and to the longevity of these movements, and the reason why they're still a pleasure to work on even today, when you think the movement's been around for about 80 odd years now, and they stopped the production of this movement in 1965. It really is quite impressive to think that they've lasted so well. A lot of watchmakers will be familiar with the amount of wear that you see in even modern movements, and to take these apart now, so much further on from when they were made, and to see the lack of wear, to see the way everything bolts together so nicely, really is a pleasure to work on them. And it's certainly a watch that I would recommend should be in any good collection, simply because to me it marks a sort of high point in the mass production of mechanical movements in Switzerland, and I don't think there are many better quality movements out there, in my opinion. Obviously, when it comes to finesse, in terms of finishing and very fine movements, then you could say that there are other brands that have sort of excelled and exceeded in that area. But looking at it from a watchmaker's perspective, from someone who takes them apart and puts them together, I think what I'm really looking for, over and above the sort of qualities of sort of fineness or finishing, are really something that bolts together well, that's something that's going to last, something with very good quality components. I certainly think the 30mm is at the pinnacle when it comes to using those terms to define what makes good watch movement. So if you have any questions about the movements or any comments, if you've worked on these, if you've got one of these in your collection, then please put in the comments below. I had a great comment on the last video from someone who's now in Canada, who's got an Omega 30mm and is also a great fan of these watches. And he actually sent me a photograph of the watch. It was really nice to see that. So if you've got any information you want to share about the Omega 30mm, that'd be really great for anyone else coming to the video. They can check that out in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please hit the subscribe and hit the bell for notifications, because obviously we want to take as many people as we can along on this journey. I'm producing weekly videos in this series, so should be weekly videos pretty much every week about how we're getting on, and my intention with the series is to continue to look for interesting watches to repair or restore that hopefully can add value to what I'm able to show, but also add fiscal value in terms of the way that we're progressing towards actually buying that Rolex watch at the end of it. I'm hoping I can get there before the Rolex prices sort of keep going up, because there is a sort of slim chance that the watch will always be out of my grasp as the prices keep going up, but we'll just have to deal with that, and hopefully that won't be the case. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and bye for now.